There's a forgotten ancient story about Spartans versus samurai, a clash between two cultures that could have changed history forever. And in the center of the conflict, there was this little Spartan boy. In the land where strength is law, a baby was born. A mother's smile greeted her newborn son. Sadly, her joy was short-lived as the boy was struggling to breathe. The midwife took the baby, and when she returned, she could not meet the mother's eyes. "Asthma," she said finally. In other words, weakness. Too weak to be a Spartan, and so the baby was abandoned at the base of Mount Taygetus, wrapped only in the memory of his mother and her helpless cries. And it was from this desolate place that the boy too began to cry. Alone and exposed to the elements, he cried out to the wilderness, and he did not stop. It worked, for a mysterious stranger heard him and followed his desperate wails until at last he discovered the boy. Scooping up the infant, the man's features twisted with a mixture of sadness, then anger, then determination. In that moment, fate was forged. Somehow, the man knew that it was his duty to protect the boy. He also knew that this infant would play a key role in history. Finally, the mysterious stranger known as Takeshi arrived back home with the child. He envisioned here a different life for the Spartan, one filled with hope instead of rejection. This led him to call the baby Kazuki, which meant one hope. Rumors started to spread in town about their arrival. A few days later, an elder came to visit Takeshi. The elder used to spend most of his day reading ancient scrolls in the temple and was one of the wisest people in town. Takeshi greeted him warmly and offered him a seat, and then the elder shared something unexpected.
There's an ancient prophecy that has been guarded by our people for generations. It foretells the arrival of a child from a distant land who will play a key role in bringing an end to a conflict between the Spartans and the samurai.
Takeshi was confused. What conflict would the Spartans have with the samurai? And what did any of it have to do with the boy? As if reading his mind, the elder went on.
A peaceful invitation will bring the Spartans to our land, but pride will turn the peace to war. There will be battle, bloodshed, and sacrifice on both sides. Though our numbers will send the Spartans home, vengeance will bring them back.
He paused to look at the boy. Takeshi was silent and held his son close. At last, the elder continued.
When the time comes, you and I shall prepare the boy, for the fate of our people rests in him.
And with that, the elder got up and left. To provide Kazuki a safer upbringing, Takeshi decided to keep the prophecy a secret. Until then, he would protect him as best he could. Kazuki's upbringing was more challenging than expected. Looking so different from the other kids led to curious stares and fearful whispers. Also, he often found himself struggling to breathe. This often stopped him from playing with the other boys. True to his word, Takeshi did everything in his power to protect his son. He ensured all the neighbors treated him well, even if he had to go through uncomfortable conversations. He even began teaching Kazuki exercises to manage his breath. Oddly, these exercises not only worked, but seemed to give Kazuki strength and power. The villagers were so inspired by Takeshi's dedication and kindness that with time they all embraced Kazuki as one of their own. When Kazuki turned 7 years old, he asked Takeshi why he was different. Takeshi had been preparing for this moment for years. It was a conversation that could make or break their bond, but Takeshi knew he had no choice. Taking a breath, the father shared the truth with his son. He wanted Kazuki to know that to him, he was special and accepted. Kazuki's eyes welled up as emotions overwhelmed him. Suddenly, Kazuki burst into tears and ran out of the house, leaving his father wondering if he'd lost his son forever. To calm himself down, he decided to visit the elder. As Takeshi approached the elder's home, his pulse quickened, and he stopped in his tracks. There was a samurai at the elder's door, one whom he'd never seen before, and he was holding a Spartan helmet. Takeshi held his breath and leaned in to listen, although he could only make out the following words. Group of Spartans, nearby town, trouble. Fear seized him, and without waiting to hear any more, Takeshi darted off in search of his son. Had the time come already? Were the Spartans truly here? Takeshi had to find his son. He ran through the streets and called out in the towns, but no one had seen the boy. Desperate, Takeshi scoured the woods. He ran down every path and searched every tree. Nothing, except the oncoming darkness and the shuffling of sounds of the night. He'd all but lost hope when suddenly he reached a clearing. There, under the light of the moon, was his son. He had the poise of a samurai and the grace of a god. It was as if, somewhere, deep in his being, Kazuki knew about the prophecy. In that moment, he was no longer a boy, but a warrior in the making. And so his training began. Mornings meant deep meditation. At first, Kazuki found this pointless. Like any young boy, all he wanted to do was move. But over time, his mind cleared and his breath flowed like a river. In the afternoons, they practiced fighting. Kazuki's aggression surprised his father. He was like a caged lion, and there were times when Takeshi feared his son's strength. Unsure how to guide him, Takeshi turned to the elder who'd foretold his son's prophecy. From that day on, the elder visited every night to train Kazuki in the Bushido code. Kazuki was becoming a samurai in mind, body, and soul. After a few years of training, the time had come for Kazuki to take his next step in his journey. In a solemn ceremony, Takeshi presented Kazuki with a magnificent katana. He explained that this katana had once belonged to his beloved son, who had dreamt about becoming a samurai. Tragically, his son died, but now Kazuki could fulfill his son's dreams. As Kazuki held the katana, he felt a strong bond to the blade. It was as if the blade had just chosen him. To complete his samurai training, Kazuki had to join the local dojo. With his newly acquired katana, he felt ready to take on the next challenge. One day, he went to the dojo led by Sensei Masato. Their leader was known for his strict standards and fearsome reputation. As Kazuki went in, everyone stopped training. The atmosphere turned cold. Sensei Masato's penetrating eyes fixed on him. Kazuki mumbled some words that didn't make sense. Then the sensei told him to leave. As Kazuki headed outside, he turned and asked him to give him a chance, but Sensei Masato had already made up his mind. Once outside the dojo, Kazuki's eyes welled up, and then he grabbed his katana and hit as hard as he could the nearest tree. Later in the day, Takeshi noticed his son's turmoil. He took him to the riverbank for a peaceful walk and explained that Sensei Masato had a lot resting on his shoulders. Training the samurai was no easy task. Everyone looked to him to protect the town. Kazuki just had to be patient and show his true skill. Suddenly, a Spartan emerged from behind the trees and launched his spear at Kazuki. Seeing it just in time, Takeshi pushed his son aside and stood to face the warrior. Combat began instantly. The Spartan was strength, power, brute force, but Takeshi was swift, agile, alive. In awe, Kazuki watched as his father countered every blow and averted every advance. It was as if knew his opponent's next move. Finally, seeing an opportunity, Takeshi sidestepped the Spartan and delivered the final blow. This fight was over, but they knew more would come. Without wasting a moment, Takeshi grabbed his son, and they hurried back to the village. Fear surrounded the town. By the time Takeshi and Kazuki arrived, the streets were deserted, doors were locked, and curtains were drawn. As they passed the houses, Kazuki heard the hushed whines of children and the panicked murmurs of mothers. They were relieved to see samurais, led by Sensei Masato, holding position at the entrance of town. In the distance, the war cry of the Spartans rang clear. They could already hear the distant sound of Spartan war cries. Kazuki desperately wanted to fight, but Takeshi wouldn't allow it. After a bitter goodbye, Takeshi sprinted to join the samurais at the front. Takeshi was ready to protect his town. Immediately ahead, the Spartans stood in tight formation, but it was the samurai who made the first move. Pulling back their bows, they unleashed a torrent of arrows upon the enemy. Metal shields glinted as the Spartans deflected the arrows and continued to advance. The samurai charged too, and before long the battlefield trembled with the pounding of feet, the clashing of armor, and the bold cries of honor and glory. The town transformed into a battleground, and every corner echoed with sounds of steel and brutality. Sensei Masato's voice rang out above the chaos, commanding his warriors with a cry that cut through the clamor of battle. His team of samurais were holding their ground, but a second group of Spartans emerged and flanked them from the other side. Instantly, Takeshi rallied a smaller group of samurais to block their way. He led the charge, inspiring others with his bravery. Unable to restrain himself any longer, Kazuki joined the fray. His heart pounded as he raced towards Takeshi's. He was determined to prove himself. The Spartans put up a fierce resistance. This fight was for their brothers, and they would allow no retreat. Takeshi fought with every ounce of his strength, but the Spartans fought harder, and it wasn't long before he was separated and cornered by the enemy. One by one, they huddled around him like a pack of wolves. When one Spartan broke away from the huddle to step towards him, Takeshi knew then that it was his time to die. Brandishing his katana, Takeshi cried out and charged forwards, only to receive a blow that brought him to his knees. Kazuki rushed to his side, his eyes awash with tears. Takeshi met his gaze, and with his last breath whispered,
"My son, you're the chosen one. Only you can end this war."
With Takeshi's last words echoing in his ears, Kazuki rose to his feet, a new fire within. Spartans fell before Kazuki's relentless assault, unable to withstand the fury of his attacks. It was a perfect mix of Spartan strength and samurai grace. The Spartan leader, once confident in victory, now watched in disbelief at Kazuki's rampage. The samurai followed the boy in awe until eventually no Spartan was left alive. The battle had finally ended. After the battle, the village mourned their dead. Everyone in the town came to honor Takeshi and the sacrifice he'd made. Kazuki, now a hero, was approached by Sensei Masato. With respect in his eyes, he invited Kazuki to join the samurais in the dojo. For a second, Kazuki's grief was replaced with a sense of belonging and purpose. As he turned his gaze to the red horizon, Takeshi's last words echoed in his ears.
"My son, you're the chosen one. Only you can end this war."
As the village began to rebuild, a fragile peace settled in. Deep down, the people knew the conflict wasn't over, and the samurai started planning their next move. The absence of Takeshi had left a void in Kazuki's heart, one he was sure could not be refilled. For now, all he could think about was his mission, to avenge his father and honor the fallen.